Okay, good morning. Welcome once again to the last day of our wonderful conference, and we have now plenary with Professor Scott Grills from Brandon University, and we are coming back to our very important topic about generic processes. Please, Professor, you can start.
Thank you so much, Christoph, and thank you everybody for making your way here on the last full day of the conference in the morning after last night. I was telling a couple of people last time I was at the ASAs. I was speaking in a deviant session Sunday morning at 8:30. Yeah, oh, and do you know where the deviants people are Saturday night, right? They are not planning on a Sunday morning session, so it's very nice of you all to come by. What I'm going to be talking about today is when I was asked to come along and looked at the theme of the conference, I thought it was an ideal opportunity to try to draw together some of the things I've done over the years and talk with you a little bit and make a case for generic social process theorizing. Consider some of the opportunities in front of us, some of the challenges, and modestly, in a way, suggest some areas that we might attend to as generic social processes, perhaps more fully than we have. One of the criticisms occasionally I get from colleagues who are outside of symbolic interaction and outside of this area is they say that one of the nice things about sitting on a doctoral committee for symbolic interactionists is that the literature doesn't change, right? They already know, right? We're going to be talking about Mead and Bloomer, and they criticize us for not having to keep up. Right? Well, that's not entirely fair, is it? So I think it's important to take time for playful and creative thought as we think about our ideas. And from my perspective, we have something in common if we're trying to figure out how the social world works. What is the human condition? How does life happen? And over my career, I've taught in business programs, I've taught in nursing programs, I've taught in a school of music, sociology departments. And all of these people, from all those various kinds of disciplinary traditions, you can find colleagues who are interested in how the world works. And if you've got a colleague who's interested in how the world works, you've got a potential future attendee at this conference. Okay? And so from my perspective, I want to try to take up the project of looking at generic social processes, and at the risk of really rather oversimplifying things, as Earl Rubington suggested many years ago now, there's a rather simple distinction to be made, and like all of these, they're rough and ready and there's problems with them, but we can make a distinction between those who view the world as objectively given and those who view the world as subjectively problematic. And I've heard various papers here at this conference where you've been engaging people who have viewed the world in objectively given ways, and you're taking them on with your research and your concepts, your analysis. But I think one of the things we generally share within the interactionist community is that we tend to take the world as subjectively problematic, that people's definitions of the situation matter, and we're concerned about understanding those things. But personally, I'm not so interested in undertaking an exegesis of examining this or that author, of forcing them into a particular box. And as Bob Proust was suggesting yesterday, for example, when you look at the work of Emil Durkheim, the quick way to say one thinks about Durkheim is as a person who views the world as objectively given. If you read The Division of Labor and the like, the rules of the sociological method, you can kind of lean towards that conclusion. But one of the courses I teach is the sociology of religion, and I have my students read aspects of the elementary forms. And sure, there's a utopia notion in there, to touch on some of Robert's notions yesterday, right? I mean, Durkheim imagines a world without religion. He imagines a progression as societies become more complex, but he also writes about ecstatic religious experience, right? He writes about ritual, right? He talks about the lived experience between the sacred and the profane. There are elements of that work which are wonderfully subjectively complex. So I'm not really that interested in putting people into particular little boxes. As I said, if they're interested in how things work and how people understand things, then I'm interested in learning from them. So as we move forward thinking about about generic social processes, one of the tensions here is between those who develop causal models of the world that somehow are supposed to explain how we end up where we are, and those who ask how. Right? And I would argue that's where the prize belongs. Those people who are able to help us understand how the social world works. To rely upon what Becker calls ultimately sequential models of understanding human group life. Now, what I would like to suggest is that in order to encourage our students and our colleagues to join us in this enterprise, there may be some useful invitation points. Okay? Points at which we may have a commonality that we can draw folks in. And I think, and I want to talk about 3 of those, not to suggest there's only 3, but 3 that I have found particularly useful in encouraging my students and my colleagues to kind of join in this enterprise. And one of these is thinking in duration, right? And that's the important move of beginning to look at what Becker talks about, these great black boxes. We know what comes before, to some extent. We know what comes out the other side. But we don't necessarily understand the processes that go on in between. And it is important to draw upon this notion of thinking in time, of, as Bergson referred to it, the durée, of thinking in duration. Now, there are challenges with drawing upon Bergson, and I fully recognize that. But he did something really, really important in that he encouraged us to think about social life as occurring over time and not being driven by some utopian outcome that required a resolution. He rejected dialectical reasoning, he rejected utopian reasoning, and in essence allowed us a multitude of juxtapositions. And those of you who are interested in the sociology of emotion, Bergson is a very, very useful guy to look at because he talks about the move from repugnance to fear, from fear to sympathy, from sympathy to humility, and from humility to the understanding of the other. So when we encourage people to think about life in duration, we're really thinking about encouraging them to think about the processes that go into selecting from lines of action, to draw upon Bloomer's key notion. Okay? Secondly, an invitation into generic social process theorizing, I think, is to be found in the pursuit of intersubjectivity and the social construction of reality. Back in the late 1970s, the New Yorker magazine ran a cartoon. There was a series of filing cabinets, okay? And these filing cabinets had labels on them like our facts, their facts, absolute facts, neutral facts, bare facts. And of course, if we were drawing that cartoon today, we'd put a new one on there, right? Alternate friggin' facts, right? That's what we would do. We would have a new one there, right? And as we are engaging others today, the social construction of reality narratives are lively and engaging, and they provide us opportunities to draw out the world in the making. And I know there's a strong shared understanding here in this room about that tradition, but I don't think we should underestimate its importance as a means of inviting people into this conversation. And lastly, as a way of an invitation point, I think the sociology of forms and types is particularly useful here. For example, in his essay on generic social processes in '84, Couch writes, "To be sure, in order to study social processes and social relationships, it's necessary to listen to and observe what people do. However, there's a fundamental difference between attempting to elucidate the nature of life among professional gamblers and the elucidation of the principles of how human beings organize themselves when constructing games based upon random phenomena." Okay? And in that little sentence, Couch points us to this fundamental work of turning towards generic social processes and social types. If I might be allowed a little story, I teach at a Canadian university where about 30% of our students are First Nations students. And by that I mean First Nations, Métis people, Mestizo people, right, and Inuit people. Okay? About 30% of our students. And so they're in a sociology class for the very first time. And you know, one of the 2 pieces I have those students read in first year is The Stranger. Either Zimmels, right, or Schutz's, right? And For those students, I can tell you that is a potentially transformative essay to read because they are experiencing the social process of being strangers on this campus as they come from rural, remote, indigenous communities into our discourse, right? And so my point is fairly simple. This strong research we have into social types and the processes that produce them can provide an avenue for our students to engage our so important concepts, okay? So I think we have a really strong tradition within which to invite people into the discourse. And out of that, as Fine helped point us to in '93 in his Glorious Triumph paper, there are some things we've done really, really well, okay? And I just want to point us to them. We have done, I think, collectively, a pretty fine job of building on the social constructionist position. Right? We've developed fairly strong understandings of the social construction of gods and gender and illness, crime and fear and social diversity and development, and concepts like time and truth. So when you look at our literature, if you're interested in the social constructionist literature, you have a lot of generic social process material available to you to draw upon. Secondly, I think we've done a pretty fine job on stigma and social control, or the area of the sociology of deviance. Back in 2003, Bob and I did a book together called The Deviant Mystique, and that book is in essence a program of research for understanding deviance in terms of generic social processes. And we're standing on the shoulders of giants when we do that, because some of the most important theorists in the interactionist tradition have turned their attention to stigma and social control. Whether it's Bloomer's work on social problems, or Becker's work on labeling, or Goffman's work on stigma, we have a strong foundation there. And out of that, we've seen wonderful detailed ethnographies. Out of England, Colosi's work on dirty dancing. Out of the United States, Peter and Patty's work, and in particular on the side, Patty's work on drug dealing. So we have a really strong tradition in terms of generic social processes and deviant behavior and social control. Also, we have a strong tradition in terms of the self. Here we have the foundational work, of course, of Mead, understanding the self as a process, not a thing, but as a process, a linguistically enabled process. And out of that, we've developed an appreciation of the self in a variety of relational and subcultural settings that we can draw upon. So when we look at that early work, the early work of Dewey and the like, we see a foundation laid that's a strong one, right, and provides us a great deal of support to move forward. Now, those things said, we do face some particular challenges, I would suggest, in terms of generic social process theory. One of the reasons I enjoy coming to these meetings is I get a chance to work with colleagues who are actually in the field. And increasingly in Canada, when I go to the meetings, we have people who are not actually studying what people do or what they say anymore. They're studying the outcomes of human activity. They're studying websites and they're doing content analysis. But nevertheless, the claims they are making make it sound as though they're studying human group life. But they're not studying human group life, they're studying the products of social action. So as generic social process theorists, we need to make sure we're getting the unit of analysis correct. Now, I have Becker's work up here. I'm very much looking forward to reading his new book on evidence, because I think we may be arguing in a similar kind of direction here. But if we're going to be talking about what people do, we better find a way to get to what they're doing, because what people say they do and what they do are not necessarily the same thing. But at the very same time, if you're relying rather exclusively on observation, you may not be able to penetrate the meaning sets that people are bringing to play in a particular setting, right? And as you may appreciate from your own personal relationships, attributing emotions to others can be a fraught experience, right? Because you make mistakes, if you're like me, in attributing emotions to others. So we need to talk to people and understand how they're viewing things and the like. And getting the unit of analysis right is important. Couch just reamed us out, right? If the unit of analysis is the joint act, you better get to what two or more people are doing, right? And Bloomer was very clear. As Bob was saying yesterday, one of the most complete and comprehensive methodological statements in symbolic interaction is to be found in Bloomer's work. And the link between theory and method is a problem for us, and we need to be attentive to it. Secondly, and I'm indebted to Bob's earlier paper on generic social processes here, we need to be very careful about chasing intellectual fads and foibles and the latest trend, okay? Concepts are not neutral. They come with a whole series of assumptions about how the world works, about how they get evaluated, and there may be fans of Judith Butler in the room. I don't count me among them, okay? I do not view her contribution to performativity as helpful. Okay? In fact, I think it's actually unhelpful relative to the interactionist project. We have a very strong dramaturgical position. Okay? And dramaturgy and Goffman and the idea of performance is a very strong notion. And it helps us understand gender rather fully. Okay? But Butler is often credited with formulating the contemporary usage of the term. For Butler, and if you don't mind, I will quote, performativity refers to the reiterative power of discourse to reproduce the phenomena that it regulates and constrains. Okay? In Gender Trouble, she writes that gender proves to be performance, that is, continuing the identity it's proposed to be. In this sense, gender is always a doing, though not a doing by a subject who might be said to pre-exist the deed. Well, Norman Denzin jumps all over this, right? Norman Denzin grabs this idea and he starts writing about how we need to create oppositional utopian spaces, right? That's what Denzin says. We need to create oppositional utopian spaces. I would respectfully suggest he's abandoned the generic social process project and adopted a moralistic one at that point. Personally, I'm much fonder of Denzin 1979 than I am Denzin 2014. And I think we need to be very cautious about grabbing concepts that have come from other traditions, bringing them into the analysis of generic social process, and uncritically doing so, right? Just because it's new doesn't mean it's better. Okay? Secondly, there's the challenge of moralistic agendas, okay? The more we're committed to advocating for things how they should be, the less we're spending a time and attending to how things actually are. Okay? Now, I'm going to give you a little narrative, and it's not from my research, it's from my daughter's. She works in development work, and she was doing research in India. And she was in a small community, and it needs to remain unnamed. You'll understand in a moment. Development agencies went in, and as part of a clean water initiative, they put a well in the center of the community. Now, few among us would argue that clean water is an arguable topic. Clean water is essential to human existence. And the well was put in the center of town, and within a week, it was sabotaged. And the aid workers came back in, and they fixed the well. 2 weeks later, the well sabotaged. It was sabotaged 3 times. They decided maybe they should have a chat with people. So they did some interviews trying to figure out what kind of insurgency and the like might be involved in trying to tamper with the well. I'll cut to the chase. It was only when they talked to the women in the community they figured out what was going wrong with the well. The women were sabotaging the well. And the reason the women were sabotaging the well was because it was a 1.5-mile walk to get water and a 1.5-mile walk back. And that 1.5 miles was the only opportunity they had to get out of the care and control of men within the community. So the walk to water was an important relational dynamic of everyday life. Putting the well in the center of the community undermined women's everyday existence and their ability to communicate effectively, engage in local problem solving, share stories about the community. Does that make sense? Okay? So the people who put the well in were terribly well-meaning, right? I mean, I'm not questioning the motivation of it. But understanding everyday life and engaging in the moral enterprise are 2 different things. And if we get them mixed up, we run a terrible risk of messing up our entire project. My 2 fine colleagues, Chris and Ariane, have done a wonderful book on the public sociology debate. Borroway has already been invoked here. I also think the public sociology endeavor is one that we need to be particularly cautious of. The way in which Borroway divides the discipline up is highly problematic. On the one hand, It's very difficult from my perspective to argue against the idea that where we are paid in large part by public funds, that people should have access to our work. We should be willing to talk about it. We should be willing to share it. That's not the kind of public sociology, though, that Boroway is talking about. Boroway is talking about a moralistic public sociology, right? He's talking about an advocacy public sociology. And it is, in many respects, I would respectfully suggest a neo-Marxist project that Boroway is actually advocating for. And when he does that, he also is taking us a very long way from these things. I might add as well that the more that we become intrigued with celebrity, the more potentially we move away from some of the key work that we're undertaking. Right? So if we become the journalists, we need to be very mindful of what we're up to. Okay. So now what I would like to do to try to wrap up my time and move forward is I would like to suggest that there are some areas in terms of generic social process that we might profitably turn our attention to in ways that we might not have done so as fully previously. And all of these in some way or another connect some aspect of work that I have done either myself or jointly with others. And this slide here speaks to management in everyday life, and it's a book project that Bob Pruce and I have been working on for some time now that's wrapping itself up. And what I would like to offer to you is an invitation to look at your own data around themes of management. Now, we're thinking of management, I think, in fairly broad ways here, right? So that any person who attempts to influence or shape others may be seen to engage in a management-like activity. And similarly then, anyone who is the target of those kinds of management endeavors is experiencing the social process of being managed. Okay? So you can look then at older ethnographies, like Dan Wolf's absolutely fascinating ethnography of motorcycle gangs. Okay? And when you do that, you recognize there are a whole set of people there who are holding office, who are engaging in management activities, who are targeting others in management strategies, right? Who are engaging in adjustive behaviors to one another. So when we're thinking about management, then we can think about anticipating office, attending to office, invoking office-related activities, being managed by others, being targeted by others, engaging in self-management, right? So there have been several papers here that I've heard as I've attended various sessions, right, where I'm listening to them and going, you know, there's a potential management dynamic playing itself out in this data. Yeah, does that work? So that when you're looking at a variety of settings, people are holding various kinds of offices, right? And if we are open to it, we may be very open to the idea of examining management in the making, management in everyday life. And this is a very consequential feature of our lives. Those of you who live and work in universities recognize how much management activity influences your everyday practices. Right, as I've chatted with you about your teaching workloads or what's coming in the fall, or will you have your appointment next year, and will the dean fund this or that, right? And your role as managers relative to graduate students, or for graduate students, your experience of being managed by others, being told, well, this project won't work out, or you can't do this research in the United States. All of those kinds of experiences are rich and vibrant ways that we can think about management in making and management in everyday life. Okay. I've got a paper coming out this year in the Qualitative Sociological Review here, and it deals with this generic theme, the creation of subcultural value. Okay? The creation of subcultural value. So I would invite you, when you're thinking about your research sites, to ask questions about how value gets established. What do people within the setting consider to be of value? How is that managed? How's it contested? This image here on the wall sold for $84.2 million. Now, some of you might readily consider that you could produce a work quite similar, but you can't unless the art world, as Becker has written about, defines it in the ways that attribute value to it. The little paper that I'm referring to is one I've done on the social process of grading amongst faculty members. Right? How do faculty members take that paper that shows up in front of you and convert it into something of subcultural value? right? Now, first of all, faculty members don't even agree that writing papers is of value. As one respondent said to me, that he had been in the game for about 10 years, and then he realized he had a whole pack of papers written by illiterate little fuckers over his shoulder, and what was he going to do reading those anymore, right? But other people take a much more nuanced approach to evaluating and grading, right? So this paper deals with value within a university context, right? But when I was listening to Sam's paper on grouse hunters, and her slides had all of these different critters on them. Well, how do people come to define one critter as particular value and other critters as expendable, right? So there are many settings in which people are engaged in value narratives and value work. Okay. Doing emotionality. Okay. I think this is an area in terms of generic social processes where we can very much turn our attention to emotions as a generic feature of everyday life. When I think of all of the research projects I've been involved with, I've done research with the Christian Heritage Party of Canada, the Marxist-Leninist Party of Canada. I've done interviews with people with chronic illness. I've done work with folk musicians, right? I've been in multiple settings like these. I've interviewed these faculty members. Over and over again, people will talk with you about the emotive aspects of their experience. I mean, I've interviewed folk musicians who've told me, if I don't make them cry, I haven't done my job. Right? They look out at the audience and they go, they're not crying yet. I'm going to do another verse, right? Because I haven't brought them to tears. Other folks, right? When one folk musician said to me, every folk musician needs a funny song. Everyone. You need a funny song because you never know when you're going to need it to deal with a heckler and the like. Right? Because they were saying, like, if you've got a heckler, nothing deals with a heckler better than getting everyone laughing around them. Right? It's not that you're making fun of them, it's that you've changed the emotive space of the room, right? Yeah? Okay? And of course, the chronic illness material, people are speaking repeatedly about the role of emotions in their lives. So I would encourage us, for example, to be attentive to learning emotions in subcultural settings, right? What does the learning emotions look like? What does doing emotions work look like? How do we address emotions that are defined as unwelcome or discrediting or stigmatizing in some ways, right? What about dramaturgy and emotions? Emotions and identity. And emotions as a strategic resource. Using emotions in relational settings as a resource in order to accomplish particular kinds of planned and desired ends. Okay? Doubt. This little book is one that I have a paper in with my partner Sheila. Just as we can talk about the social construction of reality, I would suggest we can talk about the social construction of doubt. So let me just frame this slightly in terms of this study. We did a series of interviews with women experiencing chronic illness. There were interviews with men as well, but for this project we had to parse out the interviews with men. And one of the things that we found when we were chatting with folks was that many of them had experienced multiple diagnoses during the course of their chronic illness. Some of them had been diagnosed initially with terminal illnesses. Those diagnoses were revamped to chronic illnesses. Chronic illnesses were then redefined. We had respondents who had been defined as having unspecified immune disorder, then lupus, then multiple sclerosis, then unspecified immune disorder again. Does that work, that example so far? Okay. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. So now we're interviewing these people, and they're talking with us about their relationship to their physicians, and their physicians are telling them, you're not accepting the diagnosis. Well, for the person experiencing this, they've already had 5 diagnoses that have already been set aside. And the physician is attempting to affirm their scientific authority in the relationship. Now the patient is defined as being in denial. Okay? But denial is an aggressive term. Denial is a moralistic term, right? Denial is you are not accepting the definition of the situation of the person who is attempting to advance it. But our respondents, many of them were talking about doubt, of uncertainty. Well, if the previous 5 diagnoses were wrong, maybe the 6th one's wrong. And if the 6th one, which is terminal, is wrong, then I have some form of hope. And if I have hope, then I have an imagined life that extends beyond the lifetime that's defined by the physician. And one of the things we found was that within some of the support organizations, like some of the societies that are built up, there was a recruitment to doubt. There were narratives around doubt in support groups. I experienced doubt, I experienced uncertainty, and a notion of reasonable doubt. And one of the things I found is that I think doubt is a very, very useful social process to attend to. How doubt may serve as an interactional resource, how people may be recruited to it, how there may be communities of doubt, doubt in the making, and how people resist doubt, and overcoming doubt in others, and how doubt and self may play themselves out together. And again, as I'm listening to various papers, I'm hearing concerns about provisionality, uncertainty, unknowing, and a climate in which people's narratives may be challenged and questioned. So I think as a means of engaging various generic social processes, we have this notion of the social construction of the real, but we also have the notion of the social construction of uncertainty and provisional knowledge, and the experience of doubt and unknowing that people may have. I mean, we have the famous old article, When Prophecy Fails, of people's experiences of uncertainty in everyday life and when certainty fails them. Okay? Coercion and dominance encounters. In 1904, Zimmel wrote that conflict has sociological significance inasmuch as it either produces or modifies communities of interest, unifications, organizations, is in principle never really contested. On the other hand, it must appear paradoxical to the ordinary mode of thinking to ask whether conflict itself, without reference to its consequences or its accompaniments, is not a form of social organization. So, in his recent book on subjugation and domination, Lonnie Athens reminds us of the long tradition of attending to conflict and coercion in the interactionist tradition. I mean, it's clear within Zimmel. It's very clear within Park and Burgess, who we heard referenced yesterday. The Green Bible has many references to conflict within it. Anselm Strauss deals very specifically with coercion. But, and this is an important but, within a generic social process tradition, we are open to the presence of conflict, but we do not assume its presence. It's not a defining characteristic of human group life. Rather, it is one quality of human group life that we need to be open and attentive to. And in a paper I have coming out in an edited volume, I attend specifically to dominance encounters within research settings, right? And when we're thinking about those encounters, one of the ways in which Athens encourages us to frame things is to attend to dominance encounters in everyday settings. Quite simply, in everyday ways, whose definition of the situation is operative at a particular point? And if people are resisting that definition of the situation, how does that play out, right? So in simple ways, how do faculty members engage in dominant strategies relative to students? How do parent-child relationships play out? But we make a very, very serious error if we assume that dominance and coercion encounters are tied to roles specifically. Any of you who have children know that to assume that parents have the power and are dominant in the situation have never watched children screaming in a grocery store for candy bars, right? Or the classroom at a Canadian university where all of the students decided to not take courses from a faculty member. There was a faculty member who was publicly accused of racist rhetoric, right? His vice president academic defended academic freedom, and the students boycotted his classes. No one would study with him, right? No one. No one enrolled in his class. So if we're going to be serious about attending to generic social processes, I would argue we need to be open to considering coercion encounters. So when we're, this picture, by the way, that's Howie Becker from the New York Times. When we're looking then at moving towards a sociology that's particularly robust relative to generic social processes, Becker is a useful resource for us. He reminds us that we're speaking metaphorically when we talk about things like social structures and organizations. And what we're really interested in is this everyday work of getting life done together. And that, fundamentally, is a driver for those of us who are interested in generic social process theory. How do we get things done, and how do we do it together? So what I've been trying to do in this little paper is outline some of the ways in which we can invite people in, point out some of the highlights, I think, of some of the things we've accomplished, some of the challenges in front of us, some of the perils, some opportunities in front of us, areas that we may not have mined as fully as we might have as we move forward. So, you know, if this kind of works, you may be quite interested in this social enterprise if you look at those pictures and see what? There's no right answer, right? You could be looking at that and going, wow, there's Anselm Strauss playing himself out. That's status passage, right? Right? Or you could look at that and say, wow, that stuff Stott was talking about doubt. I'm really interested in doubt in that experience, right? Are they just putting a corpse in the ground, or what's going on there? And those people throwing those hats in the air, end unemployment for them, right? You know? Or if you look at that, I don't know, maybe you see emotions work. I do, right? Angela Merkel, that's emotions work from my perspective. Now, you say I'm wrong, right? You could talk about all kinds of other things, but emotions work. Jack Hawes, right? High Iron Steelworkers, 1977. He was up in the high iron with them and wrote a wonderful little paper on emotions work and high iron steelworkers and how you have to learn how to manage your emotions if you're going to eat lunch out on the edge of that thing, and if you're going to go back to work after somebody else falls in the hole. Right? Or you look at that and you go negotiations. Yep, that's negotiations work. I'm back to Anselm Strauss again, right? Or you're looking at that and you're saying, yeah, there's emotions work going on there too. Okay. So this is intended in part as an invitation to generic social process theorizing, to be open to it, to engage it, to see the richness in it, because we have grand, wonderful stories to tell, and I've heard many of them here at the conference. But one of the ways we move beyond the case study is by showing how what we understand about the social world connects with other aspects of the social world that are alike. And it makes our work relevant to people outside of our own substantive areas, right? It gives us a wonderful basis to attend to the writing of people in musicology and nursing and in business schools if they, like us, are interested in how we accomplish human group life. And if we're doing that, we have a great commonality and a great story to tell, and that, I would argue, is the basis for a wonderful big tent, not theoretical disputes over minutiae. Okay. So thank you. Thank you to the folks here, to my co-authors, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, which funded some of the work that I've referenced. And I'd be glad to take your comments, observations, criticisms. Great.
Okay, thank you. And we can start a discussion. We have the first person.
Scott, thanks. I really enjoyed that. That was your perspective and your energy were both appreciated. I feel like I should watch your talk before I do my writing as a motivational speech. So I fully agree with almost everything you said. I was hoping to make kind of a friendly addendum, perhaps. Maybe you'd agree with it too. You sort of imply that we are amoral in a sense. You say, because you say we have to be skeptical of moralist agendas. So I guess I was wondering if the contrast might be that we have a minimalist moral agenda, and that it would include things, I have like the 5 commandments here of symbolic interactionism, treat all behavior as interesting, whether, thinking back to the topics we've had, whether it's cell phone usage or civil inattention or whatever it may be. Respect the viewpoints of others, especially the people you study. Don't impose your ideas onto them imperialistically. Be rigorous in your literature review, data collection, analysis. Take it seriously. We're in favor of critical thinking and using it and advocating for it and developing it, and especially applying that to political slogans, utopias, and things like that. And then lastly, that we believe that our research will add up to something, that all our studies cumulatively produce a body of concepts that are interconnected and are there as a resource for people to use to make sense of the world and get things done. So I like, those to me are kind of moral positions in a sense. And so I think it might be helpful for your argument to kind of make it clear that it's not other folks have moral agendas and we don't, but to say maybe we're very cautious and limited with our moral agenda.
Yeah, thanks. There is a footnote in the paper that is not dissimilar from the direction you're going. And it argues that, of course, the position of wanting to understand human group life, to give voice to the other, and the like, it includes some of the things you've listed, is in fact a position of strength. It's an argued for position. It is not an amoral position. Actually, it's a principled position that's argued for. So I think we agree, is the short answer. And I recognize that there is an argued for version of a good in the paper. Yeah.
Scott, my comment is on a slightly different level, because I really like the idea of looking at generic social processes to try and unpack and understand what social reality is all about. And in many ways, what I found in your presentation is almost to use a micro-sociological concept, that ritual interaction chain of events that one can analyze by looking at individuals and how they are affected by these generic social processes. But I think one thing that we don't do enough is to also take lessons from the more macro-sociological analyses, such as, and I think particularly of contributions such as Jeffrey Alexander in the study of trauma. Trauma as a culture, a whole culture that's created over a period of time, and particularly from the part of the world where I come from, in South Africa, the culture that flew out of apartheid, for instance, had several very, very important and very radical effects on the general population. So one of the generic social processes would be on the extreme macro level. And I don't think that is the only part of the world where this kind of macro level is very important. I think in this part of the world we have similar remnants of the past that are still very much here, where you almost have a culture of dependency within which people give meaning. You also almost have effects of sustained traumatic experiences that will linger on for long ways, and it's actually outside of the individual's active engagement and outside of that analysis of society as consisting of interaction chains. So I don't know if you want to, there are some elements of that analysis in your work, in your presentation, but I thought it's just something that maybe needs a bit more emphasis.
Your country and mine both share truth and reconciliation processes, and other countries as well. While exercising caution, I think it's important to recognize that symbolic interactionists within this tradition have a very important voice and perspective to bring to these very, very serious issues as people are attempting to understand their own, for example, national narratives, right? And the social construction of an understanding of a shared history and our obligations to one another. So we shouldn't back away as generic social process theorists from difficult issues like human rights issues, but we do so, I think, through a conceptual lens which is different from some of our more structural colleagues within the discipline. If I can go back to the first rough sort, I mean, if we take the world as subjectively problematic, then we take those processes of truth and reconciliation committees themselves as social construction enterprises around which national narratives get engaged, right? Including the construction of notions of trauma.
Okay, I want actually to go back to the question that you asked about morality. Mm-hmm. I really appreciate very much your presentation. It was really very interesting. I agree with everything. Just this little point about morality. And I think that we have an issue here in sociology with this concept. Because this always has been a kind of problem. You know, what is the attitude towards morality in sociology? And some say that we should not, be concerned with morality. We should take a distance from all kind of judgments. And so there is also another tradition that says that we have to be more or less concerned about the others that we are studying. But I think that this is perhaps a matter of concepts, because there is a kind of confusion, I think, overlapping between these two different concepts, and this is ethics and morality. So Jane Addams wrote about social ethics, and this is what we as symbolic interactionists also are trying to take account of. So we respect the other. We have to take this attitude towards the other as a subject who also has knowledge. And we are trying to take their perspectives and so, but it doesn't mean that we are trying to impose some kind of judgment on them and tell them what is good and what is bad. So there is a difference here between ethics and morality, and maybe if we, just try to distinguish between these two concepts, especially in symbolic interaction, maybe we can make our position a little bit stronger. Because we are not moralizing. We are not telling people what is right and what is wrong and what exactly they have to think about social events. We are not judgmental. We just want to respect the other, and we say that absolutely everybody, has a position, has knowledge, and we have to respect this and try to understand how exactly this can be the case from this or that particular perspective, and take it into account.
Personally, I find Becker's argument in What About Murder, What About Mozart helpful in this kind of way, where he makes the distinction between deviance and evil, okay? And therein he says, evil is really the domain of the philosopher, but deviance is the social quality of an act. And to pick, so, we can't drive the bus and push it, right? And I think Becker's point is a useful one. We can engage questions around the good, but we do so from a sociological perspective, not, as you were saying, from condemning the life of the other.
I think what you're really talking about here is the essential program for symbolic interaction, and that's how to move from individual kinds of observations of life to something that has a life to it, an idea, in terms of concepts. Two observations on that, one of which is there's that real risk, and that is it takes a whole lot more than saying that our work needs to focus in on essential social processes. Because all too often I think that, in the classroom especially, that turns into as an example of what Howard Becker said, you cite the process. And the more difficult thing to do is for ourselves and to teach our students how to look at social processes as dynamic ideas. What do you have to add to what Becker already said about labeling, or et cetera? Otherwise, it becomes just citations, and we don't want to do that either, I think. But the other thing involves this issue of studying culture as an interactionist. That's really tricky. And to go back to your mention of like Norm Denzin, later Denzin, when he was one of the leaders of the then postmodern turn in symbolic interaction, which caused all kinds of conversations and discussions. One of the concerns folks in interactionists had who were doing culture studies was one of the problems with symbolic interaction is we over-reduce a lot of things in everyday life to simple cognitive statements of definition. And if you're into the world of culture, that's not what you do. What you do is you move around in ideas, aesthetics, motion, all kinds of things that are tough to reduce, but you throw at the audience in terms of interpretation. And what we're talking about in your presentation doesn't always resonate with that kind of outlook on how to study culture. I just wanted your comments on that.
For whatever reason, in response to your comments, and I think I appreciate them, my mind keeps going to how we end up teaching in departments where they're actually more structurally designed. And one of the ways in which we could do something, I think, which is really kind of interesting, and I don't know whether you and I could get away with it, but our teaching course is built around some of these central processes rather than structures, right? Like we've got sociology, the family, sociology, religion, right? What if we actually taught a course in the sociology of negotiations, right? Then we could build in some really interesting different subcultural mosaic kinds of dynamics of negotiations in various settings and the understandings that people bring to them. Of course, from my perspective, one of the correctives against simple conceptualization is the depth and richness of the data that symbolic interactionists have the potential to bring to the problem at hand. So it isn't just enough to say, well, people in this circumstances are experiencing doubt, but rather engaged in a detailed understanding of the process of coming to the conclusion that one does not know and how one moves forward with that. And I think there's a richness that's a part of a corrective to the criticism, but you may not share that perspective, but that would be part of my response. Yeah.
Okay, many thanks for your lively talk and presentation. I want to cheekily pick up on a small contradiction between something you said right at the beginning and a point you made during the course of the talk. You opened up by saying, you know, there's a reputation for SI conferences. You know exactly what you're going to be getting. They're going to be discussing the same literature, you know, they did 30 years ago. And then later on, you warned against following ebbs and fashions in the discipline more broadly. But surely to remain relevant to wider sociology and society, which is undergoing tremendous change, we have to actually maybe look outside our own canon, or we risk becoming too niche and worse than that, irrelevant. So I wonder if I might press you and ask, you must have read something outside the sociological or the symbolic interactionist canon. So what have you read that's caught your eye and that you think is interesting and useful for us?
Oh, well, the other stuff I read a lot of anthropology, to be honest. I read a lot of anthropology. And the other, and I find anthropologists to be fellow travelers. The other literature I read a lot of history, right? In terms of my own work, those are the two disciplines that speak to me the most now. It used to be philosophy, right? And you're quite right to pick up on that tension. One of the sections of the paper that I didn't discuss is that I would argue we need to be exceptionally critical of the concepts that we've inherited, right? We need to be reflective. We need to be mindful of the time in which they were generated. You know, does for example Bloomer's model of the creation of social problems, Does it speak to how social problems are being created in a contemporary context? I mean, the people involved in the social work of creating social problems have resources available to them now that Bloomer never imagined. And it's not his fault. He couldn't imagine this, right? Does that model work? Perhaps I didn't do a good of job of it as I could have, but my key point is that we should not be uncritically accepting concepts that come to us from other traditions without examining their integrity relative to our own argument. And so just because it's popular doesn't mean we should adopt it. And just because it's old doesn't mean we should chuck it, but we should critically engage our key concepts and their link to our method.
Scott, very much enjoyed your presentation. I've known Scott since he finished his BA and came to Waterloo as a graduate student, and one of the things that I found so impressive about him as a young student was that he was so focused. He taught me about Wilhelm Dilthey, which for me had substantial implications for the way in which I understood the history of symbolic interaction. But one of the things that I just briefly wanted to mention is that from an interactionist viewpoint, we do not cheer for the red team or the blue team. We want to know how the game takes place and what goes on with the red team and the players and the coaches and everything else, and we also want to know about the blue team. We do not privilege the red team or the blue team over one another, because if we do, we're distorting this sort of orientation towards a more comprehensive understanding of the larger process. Incidentally, Emil Durkheim does talk about this issue that you reference in terms of cultural continuity. And Joe, I'll just quickly mention, there is no culture without activity. And that's one of the things that mostly is missing in a lot of postmodernist rhetoric. And without activity and the kinds of things that we look at as interactionists, we essentially, again, miss what is going on in the community. And we're students of the human community, and that's so important. But it's difficult for that, for us to connect with that and our students, because they're so used to thinking like psychologists, the individual. And what they don't recognize is that without the community, there is no individual. And Scott, thank you so much.
Thank you. Peter.
Yes, Scott, thank you very much for this presentation. It was very stimulating and interesting. I'd like to refer also to morality and our codex, yes, sociological codex of ethics. And I'd like to refer also to what Vesela said. But I think that this is not something what is constant, and this is not like the uniform, because in confrontation with reality, especially with, I don't know, some hostile environment, sometimes we should manage with this. So this is dynamic. This is interactional. Sometimes we have no choice, and sometimes we cannot just take it as the package deal, the whole conception of our ethics, because sometimes people, they require from us morality. Sometimes they require from us. This is different story when we are just proliferating questionnaires, but this is different when we are doing field study and we are with these people. We interact with them, we change we transform also with them. So sometimes I think that morality and ethics, it's also changing and it's transformed during the research. Thank you.
Just very quickly, I'm mindful of the time. I mean, you bring up I believe here that the relationship between those of us who do field research and the participants in the field, and you know, my doctoral supervisor, Billy Shafir, some of you may know his work on Hasidic Judaism and the like. I mean, his position was fairly straightforward. You need to be a mensch, right? I mean, you are in the field. You need to be fundamentally what constitutes a good person in the field. And I mean, I've done research with extreme right-wing political folks, and folks have said to me, well, how can you spend time with them? They're offensive people. They view the world improperly. And my response is, I'm interested in all of human group life. And if that's how you begin, then, as happened to me in the field, one of the people in this right-wing group, their child died of sudden infant death syndrome, and I was invited to the funeral. I went to the funeral. You go to the funeral. You're engaging people in the complexity of their lives, in the totality of their lives. If I did not go to the funeral, right, I'm not a mensch. I don't meet the standard of what is expected within the community. So when you're talking about these kinds of dynamics, those of us who engage people in the field, if you genuinely do that, and you are genuinely interested in the lives of others, and you begin with the principle that you will not do these people harm, it will serve you well, I think. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Scott, very much. Thank you for your comments.